everybody. Welcome to our talk titled Engaging in Access Early, How Designers Can Validate Concepts and Seek Feedback from the Disability Community Before It's Too Late. My name is Claire, and I'm going to be co-presenting with my colleague, Brandy. Before we get started, I'll go through an overview of what we'll be presenting. Brandy, you can advance slides. So we're going to kick it off with an introduction about ourselves and where we work, what the problem we have faced in our jobs is, and sort of barriers to engaging in access earlier. And we'll take you through a couple of case studies. Case study one is going through a redesign, a brand redesign at our company and how we tried to engage in access early. And case study two is our first foray into designing for screen reader UX. And then we'll leave you with some thoughts about how you could do this work yourself if you were interested in picking up the mantle. Okay, so we can move forward and do an introduction. Brandy, you want to go ahead?
So who are we? We both work at Verizon. Verizon is a US-based telecommunications company. We work on the app specifically that has over 33 million users. Verizon, though, has hundreds of designers, thousands of developers, and dozens of different vendors who work with different aspects of the end user experience. And we're lucky enough to have a really great accessibility team that we've been working with for years. And we realize that that's really unique. So we want to share this talk, like some of the things that we're lucky enough to have, and then hopefully you will find or highlight ways that you can translate those workflows in your context. So I'm Brandy. I'm a creative director on the design team, and I help all of the other teams design experiences for their users. So my job is to look across the entire user experience and help triage problems where they arise and make sure that everybody's thinking about the problem in a holistic way. Claire, who are you?
Of course, I'm Claire. I'm a UX researcher, mostly mixed methods researcher, and I'm also an accessibility specialist. And I help our teams, especially our design teams, understand how users use their designs.
So what is the problem? So the problem for us, one of many, is that designers often learn about accessibility issues after designs are delivered. I have a picture here from the Hotline Bling video showing Sad Drake, and that's typically like how designers receive accessibility feedback. They're, in their minds, already done with the work, and they're told that something's wrong with it. But inclusive testing practices can help designers uncover issues and opportunities earlier. Here we're showing Happy Drake, also from the Hotline Bling video. Indicating that design is amenable to change, like we should be flexible. That is, it only creates like sadness, confusion, frustration, or breakdown in the way of working when that feedback comes after, it's perceived that the project is over and the team's already moved on to something else.
All right, so why don't designers do it better? We found that there is this assumption that accessibility is highly specialized and requires this like unique knowledge and skill set to engage in. And our designers work at a breakneck pace. They move fast and juggle many requirements. And that means that accessibility testing and like thinking about access is usually associated with the development phase and happens at the end of the delivery process. Also, our prototyping and design tools that we use as a company and sort of everywhere else, as far as we know, there aren't any enterprise at-scale design and prototyping tools that support use with assistive technologies, which makes it really hard to get feedback early on in the design process. And similarly, our testing platforms don't necessarily support use with assistive technologies, and our vendors are not equipped or don't necessarily keep track of information about their panel of participants and their disability status, assistive technology use. It's just not something that's widespread amongst our vendors and vendors that exist in the world of research.
So this image here is an illustration of the design timeline that we use for the projects that we'll share today. It's one very, very large project with multiple phases. And our case studies highlight two of those phases. We'll talk to you about like how we've partnered with accessibility or how we've included feedback from the disability community at different points in the process. But with each program we take on, we try to find ways to partner with our accessibility team because we're lucky enough to have a whole team. It's not enormous. There's very few people on it, and we know them by name and have to be very mindful and considerate of their time. But we have established a partnership with them that we can engage with them frequently, and that's taken us years to develop. So in the first phase of the project that we'll share to evolve our brand, we had a generation phase. We'll talk about that in case study 1. In typical design generation phases, the goal is to produce a very high volume of work, in our case, drawings, to work through or to literally draw out a design challenge. And the way that we incorporate our accessibility team here is to review our guidelines. So we can review the guidelines that our accessibility team establishes. We can do an audit of what's working well, what's not working today. We can also establish regular sharing sessions or include the accessibility team as part of our internal creative reviews. And then we can do a lot of simple tests that we'll share to simulate the experiences of users with color perception or other different types of visual challenges, especially in a project like this one that was very visual focused. And then in the validation phase, which is the second phase of work for the program that we're going to talk about today, which is where we take a concept and try to distill it into something that has more of a definition that we validate with stakeholders, partners, end users, basically decide whether that is something that we're going to take forward. So we share these with all of our different parties for feedback. We involve accessibility in formal reviews. We also do peer reviews, stakeholder reviews, a lot of reviews, and end user validation at the very end of the validation phase. So then in the refine phase, now we've got a concept and we'll create the final design solution based on that concept that's been validated by parties that are important to us. Accessibility's involvement here continues to be a regular review cadence, and then they'll help us with different stress testing methods. And that's what we'll talk about in case study 2, to help us make sure that the design that we're all starting to fall in love with will work for all of our users. And then finally, when we've aligned on a design, we'll get to the define phase of the design phase, where we'll document that design and so we can deliver it finally to our partners. Accessibility's involvement here is in formal reviews, establishing accessibility guidelines, and then we'll take it over to delivery. So this is less about designers now and more about the delivery of requirements to the end user. This is typically what's assumed to be the role of accessibility, is usually in this phase, where then accessibility's job was just to evaluate a design that had already been committed to. But as you can see here, we're trying very hard to make sure that accessibility has a role in every phase of the work that we do. And go slide.
All right. And then so I work on the research team alongside the design process. We work to support our designers in engaging in access, and we're taking a much more inclusive approach to research. 2 specific approaches: focused and inclusive approaches will help us to ensure that we're capturing insights early and responding thoughtfully and thinking through accessibility. So a focused approach is essentially testing for something like color or screen reader experience for a specific design. And it's a kind of deep dive related to accessibility and being very intentional about capturing insights and feedback from participants that have disabilities. And an inclusive approach to research, which we're taking, is just ensuring that all of our research gets representative feedback from people with disabilities. So our business as usual process, we're taking into account feedback from participants that use assistive technologies or have disabilities, that there's just more representation as part of our day-to-day process. And I have on the current slide a diagram that is just sort of laying out the different phases of project development, starting from ideation, requirement development, planning, development, launch, and maintenance, and how the research process or different research processes can support each one of those phases. So we typically conceive of research phases in 3 types: generative, which is really early in the process of ideation and requirement generation, where we're asking questions like, who are our customers? What are their needs? Iterative research happens more towards the middle, when we're planning and developing. We've got concepts, we've got designs that we want to get feedback on, and we're asking questions about, are we building the right thing? And is what we're building usable and useful? And evaluative work, which is like typically where accessibility testing and evaluation has kind of is kind of asking the question, is the experience successful? So as a research team, we're trying to move that insights generation earlier in the process so we get more generative and iterative research that captures feedback from the disability community. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about what that might look like in practice. So for generative research, where kind of like the sky's the limit, I have on the current slide an image of the night sky with stars, because here's where we can be really creative, and we can look to standards and experimental work in human-computer interaction literature. We can look to our competitors and see who's doing things well, what challenges our competitors face. We can also use really creative methodologies like co-design or participatory design methods to really understand our users, what their needs are and what ideal end states might be. And of course, in-depth interviewing, where we can ask our users what they want, what they need, challenges they currently face, and what ideal states would be. And then for our iterative design methodologies, of course, we can conduct design and prototype reviews, some challenges with that, which I mentioned earlier, in terms of our platforms and tools supporting use with assistive technology. And then, of course, usability testing, which is our bread and butter and the UX research team. And we'll talk through, as part of case study 2, a new way or methodology we're exploring to get screen reader feedback early on as part of the iterative research process, where we simulate the screen reader UX.
So the first case study I'll share with you is the very early phases of work for creating a desirable and accessible brand. So as part of my work at Verizon, we've spent a lot of time over the past however many years since 2016 evolving our brand experience. In 2016, right when I joined the company, we released an updated My Verizon app. This is the app that our users use to pay their bill, manage their devices, buy new things. It was really colorful, very image heavy, and it was really, really difficult for everyone on the team to make this experience as accessible as we possibly could. So with each major iteration since 2016, we've made sure that we get involved earlier and earlier in the process so that the designs that we create are accessible from the start. So right now, we're in the middle of evolving the system to create a system that's more flexible for designers to use, so that we have more different ways of solving design problems and shaping up content and creating hierarchy and establishing read order and the things that designers want to do. But that we also want to use this as an opportunity to make the entire system more accessible by design. So I've got 2 links here that'll be shared out that are for our agencies, partners, vendors to look at, that show all the documentation of our design system. We have a pretty robust and well-established design system at this point. So the purpose here was to develop an evolution of that system, not necessarily like tear down and rebuild what we already have, but keep what's good and make it even better and come up with new and more ways to solve problems. So the goals here and how we include accessibility in part of this very early phase is to try to figure out a working cadence between us and all the different brand teams that were working together to develop these like very early set of guidelines, to make sure that even at the very early guideline phase, that even those early guidelines were as accessible as we could make them, so that we didn't start with anything that we know wouldn't work further down the line. So that starts with brand attributes. How is our brand going to think about foundational elements like color, shape, type? Again, we want more variety, we want more flexibility as a designer and as a developer, but we also want to make sure that with that variety and with that flexibility, we're still accessible. And then what's the emotional impact that we want our end users to think and feel when they experience our brand? So we came up with a list of what we're trying to do emotionally with our new designs. We wanted to come off as more emotional, purposeful, intuitive, dynamic. We had a short list, about 20 different words. And then some of the activities that we did, there's a ton of them, but some of the ones that we'll talk through, the design audit, like what's working well, what's not. And we had accessibility evaluation as part of that. We did a lot of color contrast simulations and perception simulations. And then ultimately, we did all of these different activities to test different aspects or validate different aspects of the design amongst ourselves, and making sure that we were in a direction that was accessible as we could be before we did a desirability study with our end users, to make sure that all the work that we were doing was aligned with the emotional response that we were trying to have as a brand. So a lot of the work that I'm going to share here is visual first, because, you know, just to parse down the work, we started with visual, and now we're in the phase of work where we're taking these same kinds of processes that we did for visual design and applying them to content strategy, which I wish we could share today, but maybe that'll be next year's talk. So starting with reviewing guidelines. So luckily enough, we have a really awesome accessibility team, and we have an established set of accessibility principles for the company that are centralized and published for everyone to review. And these are them. So generally, we have these 4 pillars that everyone on the design team and the company should be like generally aware of, that before we start drawing anything, we review these. So in our brand guidelines, experiences must work for users with limited vision. We design text, buttons, navigational elements to the color contrast ratio of 4.5:1 and use visual indicators with interactive elements. For us, that means we have some secondary way that's usually icon-based to help indicate that something is interactive on the page or in the view. Second pillar is experiences must work for users without vision. So we design experiences so that screen readers can properly move through our screens and flows. A numbered list component is laid out in order so that a screen reader moves through it, reading in the correct order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. This for us is a big challenge when we're coming up with multi-column layouts. We have lots of different comparison tables or other kinds of data visualizations. This pushes the designer to really think about the read order of these things that have a different relationship with a grid, or one that's like less straightforward, top to bottom, left to right. The third pillar is experiences work for users with limited mobility. We design inclusive experiences that allow customers with limited motor function to tap and scroll simply and easily. Basically, that means for our digital experiences, we don't create anything that relies on a sophisticated gesture. And if anybody ever has a question about what is or is not a sophisticated gesture, basically we can ask that designer back, like, well, was that difficult for you to do? If it was difficult for you to do, then it's going to be impossible for someone else to do. And then the fourth pillar, which I can't read because it's masked by the thumbnails, there we go. Experiences must work for customers with cognitive, language, and auditory challenges. So we try to keep our layouts simple and logical, and our language easy to understand and consistently structured, which isn't stated here. Our navigation elements are consistent as well. So we only try to include visuals when necessary and always provide supporting text. For us, this basically means that within a single experience or with a set of images or a set of screens in an experience, we try to make sure to follow a similar read order, and that the structure of our layouts and pages follow a similar structure. So if you're looking at a sequence of like 1 to 10 screens, the relationship between title, body, and sub parts of the page is kind of similar from page to page. Great. Yep. Okay, so then we also review what works well today. So we review that amongst the visual design team, but we also include accessibility as part of this review. So not only is it just what do we like visually, but it's also what's working well from a data perspective. So we can talk to our partners in the business side and see, you know, do we have any repeat offenders, things that aren't working? Do we have things that are working really well? And 2 images below are showing from both perspectives, from the visual design perspective and from the accessibility team, 2 different sets of documentation that illustrate how different combinations of color and text can work together to achieve contrast. And, if looking at the image, the set of guidelines that we have is pretty exhaustive and really thorough for a lot of common components, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're working well in practice. And that could also just be from an internal perspective. We might have things that are very well established and very well documented, but they're actually like hard for a designer to use, or they're not appropriate for the content that we have anymore. We need to change them. So we organize all of those things into some current issues. And so for us, we have some repeat offenders, or things that are very difficult for us to work with. And that's carousels, right? In our current experience, we use carousels a lot as a way of organizing content. The content within the carousel in the first image shows something that's very low contrast, text on image. The text is very, very difficult to read. And it's very hard for us to govern contrast in this pattern. It's also very hard for a user using assistive technology to use our carousels in particular, especially the volume of carousels and the consistency of the different implementations of carousels. We knew that that's something that we really wanted to tackle in this exercise. And then second is all bold everything. There are versions of the interface design. We had a principle called type as art. We Swiss impact heavy text, but in practice and over time, that's turned into views where the text was usually bold and there's lots of it, and we have absolute contrast, black on white. So overall, it can make the content hard to establish hierarchy and a little bit difficult to engage with. And it also had a misalignment with the tone we were trying to establish, where it looked like we were shouting more than discussing a topic with our users. And then related to that, we wanted to have a high drama font pairing, so very big, very bold message with a light supporting content. However, in practice and over time, that was turning into font pairings or type style pairings that were a little messy or inconsistent, or lots of them over the place, which makes it hard for the eye to follow, and it makes it hard to establish hierarchy and to chunk through a page. And then finally, the fourth image, we had inconsistent use of orienting elements like page titles, section titles, headers, subheaders, so that it was really hard for a user, especially a user using assistive technologies, to orient themselves throughout a page, but for anyone really to find their way as they were moving from page to page or dancing across experiences. So in the generative design phase, the phase of work where we draw a lot, we looked at what was working well, we looked at our challenges, and we drew a lot of different minor variations of those, reviewing very regularly with accessibility, both formally and informally. So if a designer was drawing something, they had a question, is this the right contrast? They could reach out to me, or enough of the designers now understand that they can go check the contrast themselves. Or if we had a question about label or read order or anything like that, we could all bring it to a regular check-in with our accessibility team if it's something we hadn't confidence with amongst ourselves to establish. So here in the image below, you can see some things that we were experimenting with. Selected state, deselected state of interactive elements like tabs and drop downs, helper text, label text, supporting text, data visualizations, all the different sizes and states of button and label. Fills is something new for us. We wanted to use a background fill, as a way to organize or cluster content, to call it out, set it apart from another set of content, to transition the user from one category of content to another one, but making sure that we could do that in a way that is successful, and broadening our color spectrum. So we went from a system that's not using color at all, and we wanted to try to use color in a meaningful way. So we're trying to explore how we could do that, but ensure that we're accessible. So on the left side of the image, you can see some elemental explorations, and on the right, there's some in-situation explorations. So on the left, things like buttons and color swatches, and on the right, images that illustrate like fictitious layouts. How would all of that work in a plausible layout with plausible content? So early challenges in trying to evolve our brand. Again, we're working with lots of different types of designers on this work. Some had more of a brand marketing communications background, some UI designers, some accessibility professionals, some copywriters. So some of the first things that we spent a lot of extra attention working through with colors, again, like how can we incorporate more color, but do it in a way that's accessible, with particular attention to the color red. Red is part of our brand. We wanted to evolve the brand red to a new, more vivid color and incorporate it more. So I'll show you some explorations that we did to find ways that made sense to do that. And then CTAs. Designers really love negative space. They like open, they like airy, they like minimal type, and they really like to focus on visual imagery. However, in practice, there's real usability challenges with that. Not just because of the type size and the contrast, but overall the hit area being smaller, it can be harder for all users to locate. So we really wanted to balance the idea of negative space, but also make sure that our CTAs or our buttons were easy to locate and engage with. And then we wanted to establish two different themes. So again, with color, we wanted to have a dark theme and a light theme for different types of experiences to use, but we needed to make sure that every combination of colors and elements for those two themes was accessible. And then orienting elements like eyebrow, label, and header. Again, designers love minimalism. We like to remove these elements and rely on visuals for users to orient. However, in practice, that's really limiting to users. And people really need these kinds of elements. They need them consistently to locate things in practice. So I'm going to just share quickly some examples of how we made some experiments to illustrate the use of red. We had an original hex value from our brand team that they were really excited about. And we took that through some plausible sketches that are in the illustration below, different types of layouts that feature that red as hero text, as a fill, as small text, in combination with white, in combination with black. And we drew a black box through ones that didn't meet contrast. We did this so that we could show everybody in the greater team how we can't use this in a digital context because it doesn't meet accessibility guidelines. This was very helpful above just saying, oh, hey, that color is not accessible, but showing different types of designers how it could be problematic rather than just calling it out. Here we made some color simulations to show how users with different types of color perception would perceive that color in practice to see, for our partners so that they could understand, hey, do we still want to do this? And we do this not just for the red, but for any time we're working with color, especially when you're working with multiple colors in the same space. So in this visualization here, you can see the same layouts, the same color fill, but run through a color simulator so that people can see how red might be experienced differently by different users. So then finally, we did a comparison of the original color recommendation and came up with a recommended color recommendation. Again, using the same layouts as a control and showing like how we might recommend using red. So we went from we would use red a lot to now using red as really just a way to accent and draw attention towards a smaller piece of information that might be important in lots of different pages. And then the final thing that we did to help communicate the importance of accessibility for the particular issue of red was just pulling together some statistics that help some of our partners understand the impact of a decision like this. So here I pulled together these specific facts that I've referenced below, that 8% of users might have a color perception challenge that they may not even be aware of, and that 5 to 20% of the population might have difficulty viewing specific colors digitally. And those users might actually experience this color painfully. I luckily happen to be one of those users. So I say luckily here because I was able to take a stat and add some anecdotal and personal information to that statistics to communicate to my partners how important it is, even though it seems like a small thing, how dramatically it actually impacts me in my experience of this. So the original color set with some very specific pairings is really hard for me to experience, and getting all the way into the drama of seizure with this particular challenge, it would be a risk, especially in some instances. And then finally, just getting into the 12 million low vision, no vision statistic, that especially for I think an application like ours, we have so many different types of users. They have a difficulty enough interacting with the text, so adding the additional challenge of color and small text is a lot for them. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding all these issues and making an experience that all of our users enjoy using. We took basically, and a lot more. I'm just showing you some of the things that we did for the issue of color. We did the same kinds of activities for all of our challenge areas before we did a desirability study. So this phase of work ended with a desirability study to make sure that the types of choices that we were making were resonating with our end users the way that we wanted to resonate, that they were expressing ideas about our new direction that were aligned with the ideas we wanted to express. So the imagery here is just showing some of the final layouts from that study. And then we took those into a define and deliver. So now this is what we're currently doing, is taking the output of that, working it through more, getting all the way into the details with all interested parties and putting these into production. So the image here is showing the keyboard interaction of a very specific element and all the documentation related. So some of the gaps and the next steps is that for this program, we were very lucky. Knowledge, and we can lean on our personal relationship with our accessibility team and meet with them regularly. But we have to find a way to distill this and make it scalable so that other teams can use it. Right.
Awesome. Okay, I'll pick up here, and it might be worth mentioning us sort of describing too that the designs that we're talking about today can be found on Verizon's app, the My Verizon app, or they're the refresh or rebrand of that, as well as our website as well. We had a question in the chat about where we can find some of these things. So as a next step in the evolution of our process, again, bringing consideration for access earlier and earlier into the process and how we're thinking about those things, we really wanted to encourage some non-visual design rigor as part of our process and engage our design teams, screen reader UX. And so to that end, we sought input from our users, our screen reader users, really early on in the process. Go to the next slide. We really wanted to, as the objective of this next project, this second case study that I'll be describing, get feedback about what is and what was not working about our early app concepts that we are working on. And specifically, we wanted to get some feedback from participants about a new tab navigation, new page structure, as well as the sort of brand identity that Brandy was talking about previously, infused through this new app structure. And secondarily, we wanted to explore early concepts with screen reader users and methods for doing that. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. On the current slide, I have an image, a diagram of a page with its sort of semantic HTML elements, as well as a tab order kind of like mocked up on it, just to sort of highlight and demonstrate how we were thinking through structurally this sort of screen reader UX. But this work in this project was really a cross-functional endeavor in which design and research collaborated, develop a non-visual UX and script that experience as part of our user testing. And I'll talk about how we did that on the next slide. So designers were given a crash course about screen reader basics, how they function, as well as the kinds of information that would be relevant for screen reader users. And through this process, we were able to identify the semantic structure that would be communicated to screen readers at an element and component level in our new app concepts, like what screen reader users would encounter on the page, including the elements, names and roles, required interactions, values, all kinds of announcements. And we basically created a mapping or listing of how each app screen would be encountered by a screen reader user. And this served as a script for testing. So for example, we had on the accounts page would have heading level 1, accounts. And then any items or elements or components within that section under heading 1, any CTAs or calls to action, buttons, links, for example, turn on auto pay button. All of those things would be just sort of documented in a list that would serve for a script in testing. If we go to the next slide, our sessions for the research that we did after establishing this non-visual UX, we had 30 participants in total for this study, and a mix of participants with different self-identified abilities, people without disabilities, people that identified as having low vision. We had 4 participants that identified as blind and used screen readers. We had participants that were colorblind and participants that identified as having some kind of cognitive disability. All of the sessions were run remote, were moderated by myself and lasted about 60 to 90 minutes. minutes, and participants were either reviewing a branded prototype experience, or if they were screen reader users, they were encountering this like station of the screen reader UX. All participants were given items to find, tasks to complete while thinking aloud. If we go to the next slide. So screen reader sessions were moderated by myself, as I mentioned, and at the top of each session, users were asked about their assistive technology, basically their stack, what they use, what type of screen reader, what browser they normally use, as well as how they normally encounter and explore new applications. Really important to get a sense of how our users explore through either structured exploration, finding information and getting a lay of the land through headings, or targeted search, or just sort of listening to the page from start to end. And then as a researcher, I essentially played the screen reader while the user described the commands or gestures that they would use to find information and complete tasks. And I would sort of respond with the script. As well as confusion that resulted from page structuring that we had. And although screen reader users were able to complete tasks at the same rate as non-screen reader users, we observed more and amplified usability issues. So really helpful insight here. So we can go to the next slide. I have a quote from a participant who said, a lot of different sections, and named the sections on the page. I felt I ended up getting lost. It's like a maze. You had to keep backtracking to get where you needed. Super helpful sort of quote from a participant that helps to kind of like humanize some of the usability issues that participants were finding. And if we go to the next slide, I'll get into just a little bit more detail. I know we're short on time, but screen reader users, again, helped us to identify, inconsistent information architecture, and they reported having difficulty with the inconsistent heading structure. They would, on one page, find that there was great heading structure and get used to finding information and completing tasks by using that sort of like structured exploration through headings, but that wouldn't be on the next page, and they would miss information or have to kind of backtrack. And that's where they encountered this kind of maze of information. Similarly, the inconsistent application navigation on different pages made information easy to miss, and our information groupings were not intuitive. Skip the details for now, but it was very useful for designers to go through this process, and these findings were put into action earlier than they would have previously if we didn't go through this process. Okay, next slide. I can talk about some of the things that we feel really worked and some of the things that we'll be looking to do differently next time. So designers engaged with access early on. It was amazing, and they were able to be really thoughtful about the screen reader experience for testing. It took about an hour and a half to like go through and name all the different elements and components and just be intentional about what each of those things were on the page. And the process was educational and gave them that experience of thinking through the non-visual UX. The screen reader users provided really valuable insights about design features that impede not only screen reader usability, but general usability as well. And we can do this at scale. Again, it took an hour and a half to go through these sessions. It's something that we can build into our process, and we've just sort of demonstrated the value here in this case study. Going forward, what we need to improve is we need to make the time to build this into our process more regularly. And we do need to have more regular training of our designers, either when they come into the company or also to kind of like maintain their interest and understanding around accessibility, and also having more regular integration with the accessibility team when we're doing these like early like concept development and evaluation work would be really great going forward. All right. So yeah, we wanted to leave you with some thoughts. We are super short on time with how you can, again, pick up the mantle and do some of this work if you're interested. We respect and understand that not all people that are interested in accessibility working at companies have access to the resources we do at Verizon, but we can be scrappy and we can do this. So if you don't have an accessibility, want to kind of like remind you or tell you that accessibility is a team sport, and in fact a sort of distributed model of responsibility makes teams really successful in implementing and thinking about accessibility. So know your role and how you can contribute to accessibility if you're touch product in any way, and use web tools and start describing what you're learning to your teams, and then share your work. Try creating a friends and family panel. We also understand that not a lot of people have, or not everybody has access to the sort of vendors to help them recruit participants, but you can use the old school snowball sampling technique and recruit friends and friends of friends and family and friends of family to create an internal panel. Also, something you could do is cold call local community organizations to see if any members would be interested in participating in research. And just make sure to include a mix of age and ability in your samples and when you're getting feedback from participants.
You can also look to others. So if you don't have any other tools available to you, you can do a competitive analysis, look at analogous industries, or do a trend map. If you're seeing a common pattern in a lot of different places, chances are it's more accessible than something you might have found on like Behance or Dribble, or more of like a design portfolio like inspiration place. And then if you really need to communicate the impact, it can be a very effective way to get buy-in. Pull together metrics that would impact the issue that you're working through, test, validate, get verbatims pulled together. A combination of statistics and anecdotes, in my experience, is the best at the volume of the impact, but also making it have a personal connection. Right, and then we've just, yep.
We do have a lot of questions coming through in the Q&A. So if you're ready, I would love to shift us in that direction.
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, let's start off with one of the most asked questions, which was about participant recruitment. So how do you effectively recruit participants with disabilities without compromising their privacy?
That's a really good question. And so we, again, as a well-resourced company, we have started partnering with different vendors that are like specifically help us to recruit individuals that identify as having disabilities or identify as using different types of assistive technology. So we can kind of fill our quotas and our requirements for each study with using vendors. But as I left off in that last slide, it doesn't have to be that way. And certainly I've at previous roles had to be a little bit more scrappy. And again, snowball sampling, using Reddit as a way to recruit participants is really effective. And I've also found, again, partnering and pairing, like learning about what local organizations exist near you, talking to directors of programming, showing up and, flyering, putting up posters on community boards can often get you some people interested in participating in studies, especially if they're compensated. And I will say you should compensate people for their time if they're giving you feedback.
But in terms of like language and phrasing of the screener, so I would use it really the same way as any other screener question, similar to like asking if they use a mobile device, like do you use assistive technology? If so, what? And then we can do the analysis and do the inclusion. We don't need to, usually you don't need to capture what the specific disability is, unless you're doing something that's targeting someone with a very specific disability, and that's more like a medical study. But for us, we just need to make sure that we have people with lots of different challenges that we're trying to understand their experience with us, so that we're not just narrowing our focus on the designers that drew the thing in the first place.
Great point. Thank you for sharing some context around that. Another most asked question was about your crash course. So you mentioned a crash course. Can you speak to how you enabled that? Who taught it? How did you teach that info, especially to folks who might be a little bit overwhelmed, particularly around screen reader use?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am familiar with screen readers. I've been using them for several years, and use of assistive technologies and accessibility before. So that was, stuff that I had, like decks and lessons that I had on hand. But a really great resource is, I'm blanking on the name now. But there is a website from, is it University of Utah? WebAIM. WebAIM has a really fantastic tutorial for different types of screen readers, just to give you the basic commands and give you sort of a simulated experience for how they work. So it tells you basically how screen readers work and the basic commands that people use. So I had the information on hand from previous teaching, but there are resources, including WebAIM, where you could kind of find that information yourself if you wanted to replicate.
Great. Another hot topic, I know you all mentioned some challenges with carousels in particular, and that immediately picked up in the chat, lots of resonance about that being a challenge. Any tips or takeaways around carousels?
I mean, so the first thing that for us, we're not going to completely get away from using carousels. We have to accept that we're probably still going to have carousels. So what we can educate our teams on is like, try not to use carousels as a way of making major decisions. So that's what we had before, is like, which one of these important things do you want? And putting like them in a carousel in our old carousel was very challenging. But also we needed to make sure that we put a pause on new carousels for a while so we can build one that's reusable, that we're confident has a very clear read order and allows keyboard access in and out of it, because those were our big challenges, getting into it and then getting out of it. We had a lot of trap. But that's it, is like asking everyone to please wait while we create a new one and then use this one. Don't create something that is carousel-like. Please wait for ours so that we have consistent left to right. We have consistent title of carousel, title of each tile in carousel, clear interactive area, clear pagination and exit. Just a foundational thing. What we had before is, I think at one point like 20 different kinds of carousels that have a similar look and feel, but technically we're all different, and then therefore like had a different method of interaction.
Great. Thank you for sharing those tips for carousels. It seems that they were much needed. Probably time for one more question today. So do you feel that brand designers are getting better at considering accessibility when designing brands and color palettes? And if not, what recommendations would you have?
No, I don't. I love designers. I am one, but no, not yet. More, the response to accessibility feedback is inquisitive and positive. Whereas when I started as like a creative director, however many years ago, it was always like it started with like, do we have to, kind of like a shrug and a pout. And now it's like, oh, cool, tell me more, which is great. I think the next step is like having the designers doing more to that. And I think we're close, especially like, the knowledge share that we continue to do, and more us and more companies like us who are big, important clients to lots of different agency partners, having a structured documentation the way that we do. It's important.
Absolutely. Well, right at time. Thank you so much, Brandy. There were lots of comments in the chat about being jealous of being in a place warm enough to work outside. So thank you both for coming to share this information with us. We so appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.